You're listening to episode 164 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Zindel Segal joins us to speak about online mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com, and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. You might have noticed that things have changed significantly in the world, whether that's taken globally or for your personal world. The pandemic has called into sharp contrast the competing needs of health versus economic concerns, and social distancing has forced many mindfulness teachers to shift from in-person programming to online. As someone who teaches in both environments, my experience is that live online can be every bit as effective as in-person, though of course, observation of key differences and modifications are needed. As is training and holding of the well-being of participants as paramount, especially in times of greater abundance of distress. Even if you've been pushed unwillingly into the swimming pool of live online mindfulness, you can learn how to not just stay afloat, but swim. Zindel V. Segal, Ph.D., is Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Mood Disorders at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He is Director of Clinical Training in the Clinical Psychological Science Program and is also Professor in the Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Segal has conducted influential research into the psychological processes that make certain people more vulnerable than others to developing depression and experiencing recurrent episodes. He actively advocates for the relevance of mindfulness-based clinical care in psychiatry and mental health. He collaborated with John Teasdale and Mark Williams in developing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, to prevent relapse and recurrence in major depression. Together, they co-authored Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy for Depression, the Mindful Way Workbook, and the Mindful Way Through Depression. Our guest today is Zindel Segal. Zindel, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Hi, Ted. It's a pleasure.
So let's start by having you tell us about your background.
I'm a professor in the Department of Clinical Psychological Science at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. I also worked for about 28 years at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, running a cognitive therapy unit for the treatment of mood and anxiety disorders. And I'm also one of the co-developers of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy along with John Teasdale and Mark Williams.
And that's actually one of the things I wanted to discover from speaking with you is how that came about between the three of you.
Yeah, there's a nice story there. I wouldn't say it's a straightforward story. Mark and John and I got together because we'd all been doing research in the area of depression, and specifically the part of depression that is very difficult for many people to manage, which is how to stay well once they've recovered. And rates of relapse in depression, when we started this work, which was mid-'80s, were known to be quite high. And there were some intriguing suggestions that psychotherapy could be used to train people to stay well, as could antidepressant medication. The challenge here, though, is that people who were being asked to participate in these programs were feeling well. People continuing on antidepressant medication were asked to do that 3 years past the point at which their symptoms may have receded. And people continuing in a kind of prophylactic psychotherapy were also being asked to come in and meet with therapists maybe when the turbulence in their lives hadn't been too great. And I received a little bit of money from the MacArthur Foundation to develop a version of cognitive therapy that could be used in this same way for people who had recovered from depression, to help them stay well, to prevent relapse. And I essentially used the money to bring John and Mark to Toronto and to start a series of meetings and discussions around what that would look like. And it was inside those meetings that the seeds of mindfulness were really planted and explored in some way that allowed us to take it and move it into something that we could offer to patients.
And was that something that was introduced from your own practice, or did three of you have some familiarity with it? How did that show up in these conversations?
You know, it was really, really fortuitous. We haven't, we didn't really have a trajectory of our own practice per se. So there were, I would say, internal and external inputs. The internal inputs, I mean, I flirted with transcendental meditation when I was 18. I flirted with something called Ekankar, which was the science of soul travel, when I was 18. Tai Chi, you know, and then I went to McGill and became much more empirical in my approach, and also because those approaches really lost me by claiming special powers or moving into realms that I just, you know, experientially couldn't buy into. So I was aware of it, but John Teasdale, I think, is the one who had the most of a commitment to meditative contemplative practices. And Mark Williams himself had been ordained as an Anglican minister, but left it at the side. So we weren't entirely, this work wasn't entirely unknown to us, but it wasn't the first thing that we were looking to embrace. We thought that we could develop an effective, streamlined version of cognitive therapy. Mm-hmm. And that in order to do that, we needed to isolate the components of cognitive therapy that helps people become their own therapists, that teach them how to self-regulate when they're no longer seeing a therapist, when they're no longer with someone, but are still encountering difficult and challenging situations. And our best guess about what that was is essentially this ability to decenter, in other words, to get some distance on the mental contents that one has without fully identifying and buying into that. We thought cognitive therapy did a very good job in teaching people how to do that. That's what we wanted to teach people to do for themselves in the context of a prevention program.
And what an interesting area to explore is, how do you get people who are no longer symptomatic, they've gone through their depression, how do you really convince them that no, this is something that would prevent that from going, that it's not just when you're really in the midst of a depression, but really how do you prevent that from happening? Even though you feel great now,
yeah,
here are some things that can help you along with that.
Yeah.
So how did that go? How long did you three work on this, and what got you to the point of having the end result of the program we know today of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy?
Well, this is one of the challenges that we looked at, because we knew that cognitive therapy, and there was good empirical data that suggested that people who had cognitive therapy prevent relapse from occurring on par with people who continue to take antidepressant medication. But one of the core principles of cognitive therapy is that it really works well when you've got a lot of negative thinking happening. And so if you're acutely depressed, you can pull out a thought record. You can engage in behavioral activation. You can do these things that make a lot of sense. But what about when people are feeling relatively well? And what about when they're not encountering a lot of harsh critical thinking, but there still is that looming risk? And so we needed to find a way of allowing people to practice this ability to watch their thoughts, regardless of their moods,
Right.
regardless of whether negative or positive thoughts or neutral thoughts were present. We needed to teach them a way of doing that on an ongoing basis so that when things show up, they will have had some of the rehearsal and practice under their belts to be able to work with it. Mm-hmm. And so so that, I guess, is more of the internal inside our group process. The external process came from a couple of sources. Marshall Linehan, who is the founder of dialectical behavior therapy, was doing a sabbatical in Cambridge. And John and Mark were there at the time. And she was sort of curious, well, why are John and Mark going to Toronto? And why is Zindel coming to Cambridge? And what are they talking about behind closed doors? And Marsh at that time was starting to develop and promote dialectical behavior therapy, which had a mindfulness component in it, although it's relatively brief. She started to talk about the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn and how John and mindfulness may be a way of providing direct training in this ability to step back and observe mental contents. And we kind of had a meeting, and I remember we folded that into our meeting. You know, this is what Marcia recommends, and John Teasdale had a little bit of awareness of mindfulness. And because we were in a spirit of being open, we didn't have a grant that required us to deliver data on 100 patients in 2 or 3 months. We actually, I remember very vividly leaving the office where we were meeting. We marched up to a local bookstore in Toronto and we bought copies of Full Catastrophe Living. And then we just started to read through the book. And in an interesting example of what Piaget would probably call assimilation, we read and found sections in the book where John is writing about watching your thoughts, watching them come and go, not identifying with them, not following thinking, coming back to the breath. And we saw those as essentially describing a similar process we could recognize as happening in cognitive therapy. And we didn't jump to this conclusion, but we felt like Jon Kabat-Zinn could be a good cognitive therapist. And as a result, he's someone that we could talk to. So there was this way in which we felt that we were speaking the same language, at least at the level of mechanism, even though we're coming at it from entirely different roots. And that opened up a dialogue. We sent John a letter. We introduced ourselves. John was very gracious. He invited us to the Center for Mindfulness. We came into first time we met him was at one of his classes in this large, I guess it was like a gymnasium with all kinds of people, and we came in and we were invited to sit down or lie down on a mat and do a body scan, which we were like, I looked over Mark and I'm like, what the hell is this? What did we get ourselves into? And then we would, as we did, go to a lot of the meetings, and then we would kind of caucus ourselves to try to understand what we were seeing. So it was a very interesting time of trying to hold on to commonalities, but at the same time, recede back into our own interpretive framework. I would say those were the ways in which I would characterize the early days of MBCT.
Great. Thank you for that overview. It's interesting to hear what that trajectory was like and that background story.
Yeah.
Most of the rest of us are not aware of. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit to the study. It was just published. Outcomes of online mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for patients with residual depressive symptoms. And the interesting thing why this caught my attention was the online part. And with events in the world, it's now not just strategically a good idea to offer mindfulness courses online, it's critical. Many of the people that I teach through Oxford Mindfulness Center, other locations, I'm teaching live online, have been resistant to it. And now, of course, in order for them to continue delivering it is needed. So I'm wondering, when did you first consider offering MBCT online? Was it before this, or was this the first time through?
I'd say that this was a process that has been germinating for maybe 8 or so years. And most of my work, if not all of my work in this area, is done with my good colleague, Sona Demidzian. who's at the University of Colorado Boulder. We were both at a MBCT training in Joshua Tree, a 5-day intensive training for instructors, part residential contemplative retreat, part clinical workshop, mashed up into a residential 5 or 6-day format. And the intensity of the training was really, really good. People were able to drop into periods of silence, periods of practice, and then periods of working through the material. And at the end of the retreat, people were asking about continuing some type of connection or some type of resource that they could have. And I don't think that's uncommon, but really there wasn't anything available other than the intensity of the emotions of having worked hard together, and then boom, it's over. Everyone goes back to their homes. And we felt like it was important to provide something for folks, but we also realized that no matter how many trainings we did, if we did 1 a week every year, there's no way that we could ever satisfy or reach the numbers of therapists that would need to be trained in order to make MBCT available to an illness with a prevalence that's as high as depression. So there was this mismatch between that. And the other thing that came to me, and I really started to think about this, is that I was a bit of a vector for people asking about finding an MBCT therapist in their cities. And so you get someone who lives just like an hour and a half outside of Chicago, where can I find an MBCT therapist? And it's like, forget about it. Even in New York City, 10 million people, 9 million of those people in psychotherapy because they love therapy. There are 2 people that I can refer, and even today, there are like 2 or 3 people that I can refer to as reliable places for accessing MBCT. And so it seemed to me that even with the good evidence base that MBCT was developing, some of our initial outcome studies, the first study that Willem published at the Oxford Mindfulness Center, good data, this treatment was just not getting out to very many people. It was still almost like a rarefied intervention available in a few places, but nowhere near the amount of access that something like depression sufferers, I think, deserve. And so I looked at really seeing whether this could be developed and provided online in an asynchronous manner, where people could essentially attend a class as if they were coming to a hospital or a clinic or a center, because all of the material of that class would be available to them digitally, remotely. And for us, the challenge wasn't the technology. It was maintaining the integrity and the embodiment of what gets taught in person through its delivery online.
So that leads me to my next question, which is our bridge to the study, is what is mindful mood balance?
So mindful mood balance is essentially an 8-week, 1.5, 2-hour program that mimics the group mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It's a digital version of MBCT that you would get in person. And it captures all those features, provides them digitally to people.
And is that used as part of the study that we'll be talking about?
That is the treatment that people received in the study, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about the study itself. Tell us about the structure of it. What was that like?
So these were people who were all members of Kaiser Permanente, Colorado. So they're people who I would say have a fairly good coverage for their mental health care. They're people who had depression. And Kaiser has its depression care pathway, where if you're depressed, you get assessed, you get access to a physician or a psychiatrist, you might get an antidepressant prescription, you might not. You might see a behavioral health specialist. You might get into a group. So it's not a situation where you're not getting anything and we're comparing against usual care, which is minimal. Kaiser looks after its patients because the more effectively they're treated, the fewer dollars they're going to cost the system.
Right.
So we looked at people who were treated inside the depression care pathway alone versus those who were treated in the depression care pathway and then received a link to this online version of MBCT called Mindful Mood Balance. And we wanted to see whether that added incrementally to how well people could recover. Now, we didn't treat people who were acutely depressed. We treated people who had what's called residual depressive symptoms. And that means that people had benefited from whatever treatment they received. So their symptoms may have reduced by 50, 60, maybe even 65, 70%. But there were still niggling symptoms like problems with sleep, problems with fatigue that got in the way, that were not being resolved. And these people were caught in a kind of care gap where they weren't sick enough to be retreated again, but they weren't fully well. And there were very little resources available for these people. And that was part of the rationale for developing and giving them access to mindful mood balance.
So what have the results been? And I think you had some follow-ups on this too. It wasn't just one post program.
Yeah. So we had a 3-month treatment period where people participated in mindful mood balance, and then we followed everybody for an additional year. And what we found was there was this depression measure called the PHQ-9, a measure of depressive symptom severity. And the people in the MMB group showed a very rapid decrease over 3 months to a score that was below a clinical threshold of depressive symptoms, whereas the people who stayed in depression care eventually started to show a decrease, but that decrease took 15 months, whereas folks in our study showed it within 3 months. And they stayed there, having achieved those gains for the rest of those 12 months. And so those are very significant findings of the ability to add a relatively inexpensive module of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to the care of these depressed patients.
I'm curious, once the 3-month time frame was up, did they continue on to have regular refreshers or resources? How was that handled? Because I'm very fascinated by this. There was a persistent and a continued effect. And was there something that needed to give that a refresh throughout, or were they just on their own afterwards?
I mean, the messaging throughout the program, as in the in-person classes, is, session 8 is the rest of your life. And that whatever resources we provided, we tried to provide in a way that could be made portable and that they could take with them. So a lot of the downloads of the meditation instructions themselves, they didn't have access to the program, but they would have had access to the handouts, and they would have had access to the audio downloads on their phone or some other device. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the rates of practice, I'm thinking that although there were no refreshers, there were no sessions or anything like that, they continued to practice the manner in which these resources allow them to regulate themselves.
So from your perspective, you personally, what was most interesting to you about these results?
Okay, there are a lot of interesting things about the results. I think one of the things that stands out to me is that people who completed more of these online sessions received a greater benefit. So it's like if they came to more classes, they were better off at the end and they stayed better. One of the challenges with these results is that I might be a bit harsh, but 27% of the population that we studied who received it completed 8 sessions. So the other way of looking at that is almost 30% didn't complete 8 sessions.
Right.
But 60% completed at least 4. So we had higher dropouts than would be the case in person. Mm-hmm. And 4 sessions, having 60% 50% complete 4 sessions is considered a minimum sort of therapeutic exposure. So we need to do a little bit more to look at engagement and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think that the trade-off here is that it's a very easy and efficient way of reaching large numbers of people, and that maybe there's an offset with the fact that you could reach, thousands of people, and even if out of that thousands, only 70% complete 8 sessions, but you're still getting 60% who complete 4 sessions, that's pretty good in terms of access compared to only providing in-person access.
Thank you for that. And these are really wonderful results to see that this can continue on once the specific program is finished and people still do have access to continue with their practice.
Yeah.
Whether or not they do that, they can avail themselves of it. It was interesting to hear about what translates in my mind as a dose response, is that the more classes you take, the greater the effect, this exercise. And we see the same thing here. I'm wondering if there's anything that you're considering for future research around engagement and that persistent, and what are your thoughts just on how we can enhance that?
Well, I think here's where we get back into some of the foundational operating principles here. And so let me take you back to the beginning of even this work. I was very cautious. I mean, I was worried, but I'm going to frame that as being cautious. That moving to an online platform might actually extract elements of teaching mindfulness that would weaken the program. And so I consulted with John and a whole bunch of other people who had a chance to see some of this, and made sure that this is sorry if it's a long-winded answer to your question.
All right.
So I made sure, Sona and I made sure that what got taught in Mindful Mood Balance essentially was the same as the heart of the teaching in any MBCT class, which was 3 different ways of people learning experientially about each practice. So the ability to immerse themselves in an experiential saturation of the practice, and then to learn about it from the inside, to learn about it from the outside, and then to learn about it from the group. That's available to any user of this program. For example, with the body scan, they're guided in a body scan, so that's an audio guiding. Then there are reflection boxes where they can answer questions. What did you notice? This, that. And then they watch videos of a class that Sona and I ran, where similar questions are coming up, and they notice inquiry, and they notice how we talk about the phenomena that are reported. So with that same exercise, cycling it through it in 3 different ways. So we felt that by making sure that that got incorporated into the program, there was some degree of fidelity. So now when you ask, how can we change it with respect to increasing engagement, it's weird, but the most consistent form of feedback that we've had from participants is make everything shorter.
Yeah.
And then people even push beyond that by saying, well, go to a mobile platform, and in mobile platforms, really people don't attend for more than 10 minutes. So can you make it shorter in that way? So I don't have a full answer, but I do feel like these are the tensions that we're trying to live inside of. We know that what we've done takes some time, but it does succeed in capturing, I think, some of the fidelity to the teaching. But then the technology people are saying, it's too long. Can you get the same amount of benefit with shorter meditative practices, shorter, all of that? And that's sort of, what we're trying to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when I get that same kind of pushback on programs. A group I'm working with that wanted me to do MBSR, but could you cut it down to 10 minutes a session?
Yeah.
There's no, I can't. And let me ask another way. Could you go to the gym and do 1 push-up and never have to exercise again? Because, well, no, like, then why would this be any different?
Yeah.
This is training, and it does
Yeah.
take time, and that
Yeah.
is the nature of it. And there's not a quick fix for this because these are deeply ingrained human patterns of behavior, and that's monstrously complicated. So of course it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And usually the answer is in various environments, people will tend to choose what's shorter. And that's something I think to push back on with a question of what do you want to get out of this? If you want to be able to say, yeah, I tried that once and it didn't do much for me, then by all means, let's go with a 10-minute one-time thing. You'll get
Mm.
exactly that. But if you want transformational change that we see in thousands of research papers over the past 40 years in various ways in which mindfulness can help people, that does take some commitment.
Yeah.
It does take people taking that work on and doing that. Yeah, I agree. Anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think as we were speaking in our introduction, how this work, which I think had a bit of an exotic flavor, maybe half a year ago, I think is no longer seen as exotic because people now understand that even when there is a vaccine, even when we're able to move back into a form of social interaction that's a little bit more robust, there are going to be some things that are still going to stay in place that have come out of coping with this pandemic. And I think that some of that might be the skepticism about online delivery and maybe some of the benefits of having people from anywhere access programs that are available on virtual platforms. I think that's a good thing. We just have to get it right in terms of making sure the content that gets conveyed, has all of the same heart in it.
Thank you for that. And for those who are listening, I'll have some links on the episode page for this episode, as well as to several of the books that Zindel has co-authored along with the others. Our guest today, Zindel Segal. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Ted. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.